afternoon, we almost have a guitar. So now that the neck's finished, back to working on the body, and I started out with the jack. So the first thing I did was to mark with an awl the centre point where I wanted the jack to go, and then I routed the roundover on the back using a 5mm roundover bit. And I did the roundover prior to drilling the hole, because if the hole's already drilled, then the bearing for the roundover bit would end up going into the hole, and that would be very bad. So once the roundover was done, I used a 1/8 inch drill bit to just drill a pilot hole through that awl mark, and then I came back with a 22mm spade bit, which is quite scary. Once I thought that was deep enough, I just checked that with the jack lead to make sure that would go all the way in, and then I just drilled through with a slightly smaller hole, I think about 12mm, through to where the cavity was going to go. So once I had my jack lead done, I started on the control cavity, and I just drilled through the potholes and the holes for the blade switch, just to make sure that the template was in exactly the right place. Once I was happy with that, I just hogged out a load of the material on the drill press to make it a bit easier for the router, and then I routed the shape of the control cavity. You might notice that I actually revealed some of this chamber here. I kind of knew that was going to happen, but with it being time sensitive, I couldn't be bothered to make a new template. So I made a control cover out of a piece of ebony. This piece of ebony I've earmarked to make a Les Paul Special out of, so I very roughly jointed it just to make sure that I had plenty of room to be using offcuts. And then I cut it out with my big fret saw just to make sure there was as little waste as possible. And then I did all the final shaping on the spindle sander. And then I marked out on the control cavity on the back of the guitar exactly the depth that I wanted to route, and then I just routed that using my template, and then I just had to do a bit of fettling on the control plate just to get that to fit nice and snug. And then I marked out where I wanted the holes to go, and I just drilled through there with a 2mm brad point bit so that the holes were in exactly the right place. And then onto the neck pocket, I drilled out most of the material using a Forstner bit, and then I routed that to a depth of 35mm. And then I routed the neck pickup. I didn't have to bother hogging out any material, as most of it was gone for the neck pocket. And I routed that to about 15mm deep, which was plenty deep enough for the main body of the pickups. And then I just came back with the router again, and I just free-handed the area where the posts were going to go slightly deeper to about 30mm depth, and that meant that my pickups could fit in there nicely. Once the pickups were all routed and fitted nicely, I just used an extra long 8mm drill bit, and I drilled one hole through the neck pickup straight through towards the volume, and then another one from the bridge pickup also straight through towards the volume. And while it might be a bit easier to drill straight through from one pickup cavity into the other, I like to drill two separate holes just because I'm not faffing around trying to figure out which pickup lead is which when I come to wire the guitar up. Before gluing the neck on, I sanded as much of the body as I could just to get rid of all the worst scratches left over from the bobbin sander, especially concentrating on the area around the neck pocket, because that area is especially hard to get to once the neck is in there on this style of guitar. Once I got all my rough sanding done, I fitted the neck tenon. You may have noticed when I routed the pocket, I just had a little piece of tape all the way around the template, and that just makes the mortise ever so slightly too small for the neck to fit in. And that's just because when I do all my fine sanding and whatnot, I just want to make sure that the neck isn't too loose in the body. But I also wanted to make sure that the neck isn't too tight in the body, so I've just got some 240 grit stuck to a piece of marble, and I'm just fettling the neck just to make sure that the fit's just right. I want the fit to be so that if I lift the neck up, the body just falls away, so that it's not so tight that I can pick the whole guitar up with it, but then it's not so loose that it just falls out. And the reason for that is if the neck pocket's too tight, then it's just going to push all the glue out and it's going to starve the joint. and also I'm maintaining about 45% humidity in here, so if this guitar was to end up in a much more humid environment, that means the wood would expand, meaning the neck itself would grow, and the mortise would shrink, meaning that the neck pocket becomes super tight and there's a potential for cracks maybe around here, which we definitely don't want. So once I was happy with the fit of the neck, I just glued it in using some tight bond, and I apply it with a paintbrush. Not too much glue because it all dribbles out anyway and it's more to clean up. And then I just use 2 F-clamps, one either side of the tenon. And the good thing about that is that it can reach from the waist of the guitar, and that means that it makes it easier for me to get around the neck pocket from the front when it comes to cleaning up. And then I just gave it all a good clean up with some hot water out of the kettle, probably 5-10 minutes before, and really scrub at the squeeze out with a toothbrush. And that just means that it really gets it out of the grain, because as soon as the glue gets in the grain, if you're doing a natural finish, as soon as there's clear coat on there, the glue really does show up, and it's really difficult to sand out as well. And the other good thing about having the clamps on the sides like this is it means I can run a straight edge along the frets, and once it's all in clamps I can then check that my neck break angle is right, and that just helps me make sure that the tenon is all the way down inside the mortise and that the break angle is correct. So I left the clamps on overnight, and then the next day I just used the taper of the neck to draw a couple of lines either side, and I could use those as reference to make a new centre line just in case there's been any movement at all. And I think it had maybe moved about 1/4 of a millimetre, but that's, you know, that's negligible really. But this is one reason that I like to drill my bridge holes after fitting the neck generally. So with those 2 outside lines and my new centre line, I marked out a new scale line, and I used the specs of the bridge to work out where the holes were going to go. And at this point I almost royally screwed up, because I used an awl and I marked out on the scale line where the bridge was going to go, and I didn't take into account the fact that on these bridges you tend to sit the studs about 5mm past the scale line. Luckily I noticed that when I did, and these holes are 11mm, so I marked 5mm from the right place, which meant that when I drilled my holes I nicely covered up those marks I made. So to drill the holes I just used my hand drill with a nice sharp 11mm for mag bit, and I use a couple of squares, one on the right hand side and one behind it, and that just helps me ensure that the hole I'm drilling is nice and plumb. And I just start the drill off in reverse, and I go down about 1 mil, and that just helps to prevent any tear out happening when I drill down. And I drilled down about 30mm. I think I needed about 25mm for these studs, just to make sure that they would go all the way in. And then I did a test fit to make sure everything was aligned properly. So at that point, that's all the main stuff done. It is really just a case of sanding and prepping. So I sanded the top with 120 grit. I'd already sanded at, I think 80 grit with an orbital sander when I first put the top in. So gave the whole thing a good sand, and one little trick I like, when I'm done sanding, I'll just wipe white spirit over the top, and that then just highlights any scratches or low spots that I might have missed. And then I circle those with a pencil, and then when I come back to the guitar a few hours later, the white spirit's all dried and I can sand again, but I still have the pencil line so I can see where all the bits I missed were. And I just follow those steps up to 320 grit. So with the top all sanded, I started working on the back. And one little trick I like to do is to just put some cocktail sticks in the holes and then fit the control cover down on those and then trim those flush, and that just means that I've got some locator pins holding that in place, and then I can just go over the whole thing with an orbital sander and get the whole thing sanded nice and flush and smooth with each other. and then when it's all done I can just poke it out and pull the sticks out. So when I was happy with all that, I just came back and I rolled over all the straight edges on the guitar. So the neck heel and around the headstock, all those areas when I come to lacquer, if they've got sharp edges, I won't get very good coverage and I run the risk of sanding through. So I just rolled all those over with 220. And because this is walnut, which is an open grain wood, I decided to use aqua coat to do the grain filling. Now normally I would use an oil-based grain filler, and I would pick something that's in contrast to the wood. So I'd use something like a black grain filler on mahogany, for example. But I'm quickly running out of time, and using a contrasting filler like that requires a lot of work to tape off the natural binding. And that filler also tends to take at least a good 24 hours to dry. In fact, it's better to leave it for about 48 hours, whereas this stuff is water-based, it doesn't make much of a mess really, and it dries in about, they say it dries in about half an hour, but I left it a good hour to dry. And I just put some of that on the wood, and then I wiped it all in as much as I possibly could to leave as little on the surface as possible. And then I sanded that back, I think with 220 grit. And I sanded it back to bare wood just because I've seen a couple of instances where it can leave a sort of a nasty milky look under the clear coat. And the other thing is, as this is a water-based grain filler, it tends to shrink. So I repeated this process, I think 4 times in total. The first 2 times I sanded it back with 220, and then the third and fourth time I sanded it back with 320. So once that was all sanded, I gave it a good wipe down with some white spirit to get it all nice and clean, and now it is ready for finishing. And I do have one other thing to show you. So this guitar is made almost entirely out of stuff I had already. All the parts, apart from the bridge, are from a previous build, so I thought I'd get some new bits for it, as I'd spent that money so long ago that I'd forgotten about it. So I got some parts from Halewood, some little ebony faceted knobs. I think the likes of Nick Huber use these, they do look quite cool. And some ebony tuner buttons to replace the nickel ones on my Spertzl tuners I've got. And also a little ebony switch tip. Now this is a PRS style switch tip, and it has a much smaller hole than most blade switches, and I've got a Fender blade switch, so I've been in this situation before. It just means that I need to file down the tip of the switch, which is quite easy to do with a file. So in the next episode I'm going to be staining, sealing and spraying some lacquer.